Okay, excellent. Welcome to the bi-monthly seminars that is hosted by the Southern African Trans Forum, of which members are comprised of Iranti, Gender Dynamics, Matimba, and a range of 18 other organizations across Southern Africa. Um, so we're really excited to be having this conversation today, which is focusing on basically how are we framing and understanding our own advocacy work in relation to depathologization of trans healthcare and trans identities overall, which is a multiplicity of issues that contribute historically to the pathologization of our identities. So I'm really happy to be moderating this seminar. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Jabu Pereira. I'm the director at Iranti, um, and I'm a trans man. My pronouns are he and his. And I'm really excited to be on this conversation with Mauro Cabral Greenspan, who is the executive director at Gate. And Mauro being a friend and a comrade and just somebody who has been an immense support to me personally and institutionally. So I'm really happy to have him on the conversation. And then exciting is also Zoe Black, who is an artist, an activist, um, who has brought immense content and ways of looking at pathology in different ways, and is the national advocacy head at Gender Dynamics. So welcome to both of you, and just if you want to just add to the introductions I've made of you.
Thank you very much, Chao. I'm very happy and proud of being here. Super exciting.
Thank you.
Hi, Jabu. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. It's this very exciting conversation, and I don't think I have anything to add to that intro.
Thank you. So, I want to kick us off by uh, going back before we go forward, right? And going back is about how do we really understand the journeys that we've been on to finally discuss depathologization. Where did pathology start, and how do we understand the pathology? And Mauro, can I throw that to you to start off with, so that we begin with looking back first?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I have to say that there is not an universal history of pathologization, that it has changed over different or among different regions, and also that is a history that for us in the global south, like I am Argentinian and based in Latin America, it depends on our own history of being colonized. So in that sense, I think that both Latin American countries and African countries and our different trans communities still have to reconstruct our own histories, how pathologization came to us. But at some point in time, and I would say that in terms of like historical terms, it's recently. We can locate that by the end of the 19th century, people that expressed themselves in a way that contradicted social and legal norms, and people that identified in a gender different from the sex assigned to them at birth, stopped being considered criminals or sinners, and they started being considered people suffering from a disorder. When we talk about pathologization, which is a quite difficult word, and I would say especially in English, what we mean is that suddenly a trait or a behavior, an individual or a community stop being considered healthy and starts being considered pathological, which is like suffering from a disease or a disorder or as someone that is sick. So all of that are different ways in which we are pathologized. So when our lives, our identities, or gender expressions are considered to be a pathology, and pathologization is always, and it has always been, relational, which means that that if I have a pathology because I'm trans, it means that someone else is having a healthy life. And in the case of trans people, that is cis people. So being cis or not being trans is a healthy way of developing a gender identity according to pathologizing approaches, and being trans has been considered the same as having a pathology. Um, at the beginning, of this history, it wasn't really clear what kind of pathology it was or where it was located. So where was the origin of that? And over the 20th century, there were different experiments and studies to try to locate what exactly in a human life was making people sick and making them to become trans. And by after the 1950 decade, it was more and more clear for many researchers and health practitioners, and also for some trans people, that being trans was about having a mental disorder. So that there were two ways of treating trans people. When one of them was forcing people into psychotherapy, and the other was just giving hormones or surgeries to treat a mental disorder, and in that way to allow people to live a better life. However, from the early 70s, there were trans people, and both trans men and trans women, that started questioning this narrative and this institutionalization of trans lives, saying, look, being trans is not having a mental disorder. This is what we are. And people shouldn't be classified as being sick just because our gender identity is not the same as the sex that someone else assigned to us at birth. Actually, we're just living our own life, living our own truth, and that shouldn't be pathologized. So the movement to depathologize trans people started very early in the past century, and it was growing and growing. And actually, for example, the scientific term to classify trans people used to be transsexualism, and people like us or like me, were classified as transsexuals. And our own community created a depathologized terminology, which is transgender, to refer to a different experience of being trans that was not dominated by psychiatry and medicine. Because depathologization, which is this political movement to free trans people from being considered people suffering from a disorder or a disease, or people suffering from a pathology. Depathologization is a movement that claim a right to self-determination, to take our own decisions about our own lives, because we don't need a psychiatrist or a doctor to supervise or try to cure our gender identity. So from the 70s and the 80s, there were different attempts to depathologize trans, and they become more and more, they become stronger and stronger by the end of the century. So what we consider right now, like the movement for depathologization, have very long history. But again, this is a history that most examples are coming from global north countries, and especially from the US. And I am a historian myself, and we find out that in many countries and continents, there have been previous experiences of acceptance the different cultures that have embraced gender diversity without oppressing it using criminalization or pathologization, but those cultures were affected by colonialism in the way of in the form of imperialism and occupation and extractivism, but also, you know, these waves of colonialism by the imposition of standards of care producing in the global north. So what happened over the past, let's say, 50 years or 30 years, or even today, is that many health providers and, you know, including mental health providers, but also our own communities, have been receiving knowledge about trans people, including standards of care, producing many times in the US, for example, and being exported to our countries. So we have learned to think about ourselves using their lens, which in many cases are extremely pathologizing. 15 years ago, activists in different parts of the world, including the global South, started working together to declassify trans people as people suffering from a mental disorder. And we started working especially with a document called the International Classification of Diseases that is produced by the World Health Organization. So until June last year, trans people were classified as people having a mental disorder in the context of the International Classification of Diseases. And we have been classified there for a very long time, even after homosexuality stopped being considered a mental disorder. Being trans was still considered a mental disorder. So the history of how we go there deserve its own narrative, I will say. But over the past 10 years, there has been a very strong and unified movement fighting for the right not only to get rid of the classification of trans people suffering from a mental disorder, but also addressing the issues that are connected with trans pathologization. Because the tricky thing, and this is very important because it usually, you know, implies two key questions. So for activists struggling for depathologization, it's not only about getting trans people declassified as people suffering from a disorder. We don't want our gender identity or gender expression to be considered a disorder or to be considered as people having a mental disorder just because of who we are. But the diagnosis, like for example, transsexualism or gender identity disorder, these pathologizing categories, has been required by governments in order to allow trans people to get access to 3 basic rights. So in many parts of the world, a diagnosis is required for people to have access to legal gender recognition. And in that regard, there are many activists thinking, okay, but what is going to happen if trans people stop having a mental disorder? How we are going to get access to legal recognition? And right now, there are many countries in the world that already allow people to change their gender markers without requiring any kind of diagnosis. The second thing is that these diagnoses are many times required for trans people to get access to gender affirming procedures. So, for example, if someone wants to have access to hormones or access to surgery, that person is required a diagnosis or a letter provided by a health provider.
Yeah.
So the third issue that we are addressing is not only the access to gender affirming procedures, but access to coverage. Because diagnoses are used in many requested to provide coverage. So for activists working on depathologization, we believe that we are only going to have full depathologization when we get rid of the diagnosis, or get rid of the classification of trans people as suffering from a mental disorder, and we can ensure for everyone access to legal gender recognition and access to gender affirming healthcare and its coverage. And that's why the movement for depathologization is also a movement for what is called universal healthcare coverage, because we want that all procedures related with transitional healthcare or trans-specific healthcare are covered in a mandatory way without requiring a diagnosis. The second question that emerges, and maybe something that we can talk about that, is that activists ask, what is going to happen to me in my country because the World Health Organization is saying that being trans is not a disorder? Well, that change won't depend from the World Health Organization. It depends from each country, which means that each government will take its own decisions. And actually, they are already doing that. So governments have the power, like ministers of health, to decide how they treat trans people and what human rights they recognize or they deny. But that has nothing to do with the World Health Organization itself. I will end here, so we are on time, but I'm completely open to talk to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you for such a comprehensive capture of just looking at the histories of pathology. Zoe, from our context as well, would you like to add to just, looking back on pathology before we go forward in the next 20 minutes?
Yeah, so just to we all in South Africa, we also our law and the guiding legislation as to how a person amends their sex or gender marker on their IDs is deeply pathologized, again requiring medical diagnosis for such a change. I think also in the context about the narratives of trans people has been very largely driven by the West, and specifically the United States. And there was an interesting thing that started happening in the media in the US in the way that trans bodies were represented there, and there was somehow this massive focus on trans people needing to have surgery in order for their identity to be validated and for them to be recognized as trans and accepted by the society. And so that narrative got really pushed through, and because the US is the US and their media coverage is wide, what started happening was when people started looking for similar identities, things that they could identify themselves in, and also for people who wanted to find, let's call it, information around trans identities and that kind of experience, that narrative was so strong in the media that became the dominant narrative, that our bodies were so pathologized to that extent that that was the only narrative. And so suddenly that filtered into a lot of how our society and our social interactions were constructed. And so trans bodies still remain deeply pathologized, not just on a legislative level, but on a very personal and interpersonal level.
Well, thanks so much. Definitely. I guess the issues that we're raising just historically around pathology, is, and especially as Mara was saying as well, around the global South locality of Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, etc., is really looking at how our own bodies have always been sites of struggle, right? Be it around issues around race, around gender, etc. And particularly when we look at issues on the trans body, we look at the kind of the dominant refusal of trans people historically to resist the cisnormative way of accepting what is the acceptable body, and so forth. And as I was listening, I also want to recognize that perhaps each of us who have been through a process of you know, being different in different ways, or being criminalized in different ways around identities, um, we also recognize that that is a deep wound for all of us, in different respects, and how we show up in spaces now to almost belong and to become into who we are in that respect. And I know, and I want to throw this out because in a way, when we Mila was also saying that, how do we simplify the language of what we're talking about in an engaging way, but I think, how do we look at that history and not and I guess recognize, and what do we do in the current, because I still hear, you know, trans people speaking about born in the wrong body language. I wish I was whole. um, do we regard this as pathology, or do we regard this as a different defining way of self-determination? Can I ask you that, and as a way of framing, like, what is the journey now in terms of self-determination, and are we looking at new language, are we looking at new approaches, new affirmations, you know, in that regard?
That's a very it's a very challenging question, but thank you very
Yeah.
much for posing it. I believe that we're working on to depathologize classifications and laws and policies, but it will take a long time to depathologize culture and the way in which we
Mhm,
think about ourselves and to think about the world and the way in which we interact. Because you know many people have make sense of their own experiences using that language. It was available to them, and sometimes you know younger people are using different they are even you know analyzing that language, saying I'm not trapped
mhm,
anywhere. My body has never been wrong. You know, society is wrong. There are
mhm,
always you know new ways of talking. So you know, there are more people saying I'm living my truth. This is I'm living my uh, this is my real life.
mhm,
But what I'm afraid of is that we can, you know, pathologization is a tricky thing. And the point is how we can avoid treating ourselves as believing that we have the truth, which is like how we can stop pretending to be doctors and diagnosing other people. So when we face someone and we said, hey, you're using the wrong language. That's wrong. This is the way in which you need to talk about yourself. So this way is wrong. This way is right. Well, in that moment, we are becoming tools for pathologizing other people. So what I suggest always it's just to accept that our communities have different languages and different versions to say the same thing, and just to take care of each other, you know, without pretending that we know what the truth is. Because at the very end, pathologization is about that, in believing that there is just one right way of being or talking or expressing. So I don't know if people by saying I'm trapped in a wrong body or using a different language, um, if that's more pathologizing or not. What I would really love is to see a trans community that, you know, where people are able to talk about their own experiences without being overdiagnosed and criticized by their peers.
mhm. Yeah, Zoe.
I think I tend to agree. So I'm just going to relate this to to my own, like, very, very personal experience. So when I, again, inverted commas, came out, one of the things that I didn't have was the language to express how I felt and my thought processes and how I understood myself. And so it took me a while to acquire that language. And so language in and of itself isn't like isn't an end product. It's a tool to express and communicate. And so different people have different languages in order to communicate certain things. And not everybody has the same, let's call it, set of tools uh, in order to communicate a particular thing. And so I think what often happens is when certain people say something or they use particular words that we potentially find offensive or problematic, I don't think, I think what we do is we place ourselves at the center of what that person is saying. And so we filter what the person is attempting to say through how we understand what they're saying. And I know that's a weird process, but that's how we understand and process language. Uh, as opposed to, and so that, sorry, so that sits in a context where you are putting yourself, you make it about you. As opposed to the other way around, if you are listening to what somebody is trying to say, and even though they may be using the wrong, again, in inverted commas, the wrong terminology or problematic language, if we are attempting to understand what somebody is trying to communicate, I think that is a good starting point in trying to get everybody
Mm-hmm.
to acquire not universal, but
Mm-hmm.
a toolkit that works, that doesn't necessarily demean anybody or doesn't take away from anybody else's dignity in that kind of way. It was also interesting. It was literally last night. I got like a DM from a very very young trans person
Mm-hmm.
uh, who wanted just some broad information about something. I gave it to this person, and uh, about 5-10 minutes into the conversation, the person just like randomly asked me about if I'm excited for surgery or if I'm nervous for it. And I just found the moment so jarring because so this person were in their teens, and I thought it very interesting that one of the things for them that they felt was important to them was that they had to have some kind of surgery in order for their identity to be validated in that kind of way. And that person had projected that on me to give a response in order to for me to validate their understanding of the thing as well. And so I just found the language and the understanding of, again, this depathologization of
Right.
trans bodies so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that was just a
Mm-hmm.
weird thing that happened last night.
Wow. Thank you. I mean, I guess the for a lot of us, we look to dominant mediums for messages or for ways to consume or find uh, 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 um, narratives that emulate who we are positively. But unfortunately, I mean, when we look at media forms, I don't know how many people may have watched The Danish Girl or The Crying Game and a range of other films that the L Word with the inclusion of Max as the trans character, but merely placed there to really vilify the existence of trans men, or the shift from moving from a cis community to a trans community. And so it's been quite a challenge to think about how do we even shift the mediums of pathology, the construction of disorder, even in the way stories have to be told, almost like the trans narrative has to begin at the inception of pathology. Um, and I'm wondering to what degree do we have to then say, no, that the narrative actually starts at depathology. It starts in this very moment uh, of where we are. So I think some of those issues, and Zoe, I mean, your work that you're doing at the moment, um, in how you're using the camera and your narrative and your personal journey uh, to craft a way of thinking through self-determination. Do you want to talk a little bit about just what does that shift mean to you? What does it mean for you to be in front of a lens in your isolated, dark lockdown, crafting stories that have meaning for many of us?
Um, so just context to that
Mm-hmm.
conversation. When, again, using inverted commas here a lot because language again,
Yes.
when I came out, it was a very difficult process for me, uh,
Mm-hmm.
because not only did I not have the language, but I found it very, very difficult to find narratives that were similar to mine. So I'm not like the most like social human being on the planet, and I don't like, I'm not like going out every night and meeting people. So I'm very happy to keep to myself. um,
Perfect.
so so in that context, I didn't have narratives. The only narratives that I could find were Western narratives. They were from the US, they were from the UK, they were from Australia.
Right.
And nevertheless, I went through a whole process, and I when I made it public on online, I decided that I'm going to start a blog, because there was simply no narratives, there was no information. And so I tried to do that in two ways. And the one was for me to process my transness out aloud, because that's how I like to do things. And then also to make my experience available to somebody else who might be dealing with going through the same kind of thing, so that there's a link there. And so lately I started I, so I've been very vocal on my social media, very public about it, and not in any kind of like advocacy kind of way, but just I'm living my life as I would normally live my life as a trans person. Yay for me. And then I really recently started a YouTube channel, and then that just the response to that uh was I didn't quite expect that. It was really well received. Very, I've been getting a lot of messages from people saying how much they appreciated it, because it's the first kind of thing that they've seen like that. And I thought, yay me, pat myself on the back for it. But it was a very like, or it is still a very tender thing for me, because I wish that there was content like this, and information like this, and people like this when I was first starting out and when I was doing the things. Because if it was, it would have made my life so much easier, and I wouldn't have fallen into these traps. I don't know if they're traps or that I did, and it wouldn't have been such a struggle. And so suddenly representation for me is such a big thing, and accessible representation has been a very strong thing for me that I've been trying to push in my very private capacity, for trans representation, because we don't have that in this country. At least we don't.
Thanks so much. I've added the link to your channel. If guests would like to subscribe, what I want to do for the next just 15 minutes that we have is to look at the process of depathologization, and what does it mean at a practical level, particularly for global South states where that reality of changing legislation is very slow, right? It's like um and yeah, I guess for me the question is, trans people have always existed outside of a system, and and that has been the reality for the majority of trans people across the world, and particularly in the global South. And what does it mean then to claim that existence of being outside of a system in a positive way? Meaning, are we able to create, because of course, all of us on this call are working on advocacy. We are all doing some form of other great work in this field, right? But parallel to doing that great work that we're doing, which is a long, endless marathon, and we still can't see the finish line, what does it mean in the interim, in this moment, to talk about depathologization as a lived reality and as a lived action within our institutions and within our movements? What do you desire, and what do you want to see that to be in that regard? How about you, Mauro?
Um, I, I, you know, when I see your movements and work with or or people, I see the immense potential that we have, and it's really painful to see how much not only we are missing because we are forced
Mm-hmm.
to live in those margins, but also how much our cultures are missing because we are not allowed to participate fully. I think that we are breaking that reality. There are many changes that need to happen. We are improving many things that have to do with representation online or representation in movies and creating our own criticisms of those representations. What we you know the what we still need to achieve, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
beyond that cultural justice, is socioeconomic justice. And I think that that's going to be a key issue in the agenda for our community and our movements in the upcoming years. Um, I'm very interested in being engaged in the cultural battle. What really drives me crazy is that even when we could be
Mm-hmm.
winning that, I remember, I don't remember. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly
Mm-hmm.
which journal, what magazine had this front cover saying, if trans rights were getting to the tipping point. But even when we can challenge that, we're still a very poor community and
Mm.
movement. And I think that that's a place where I believe that we need to see change urgently.
Right, right. Yeah. Zoe?
Yeah. Look, I think like as working in advocacy, we all are working very, very hard for
Mm,
a depathologization of the law. Um, because I think we all, I mean, we live within that framework and it governs
mm-hmm.
how we operate in society and the things that we're able to do and not do. And
Right.
so it does become increasingly difficult because the changing of legislation and law in that kind of way, it takes time. So it's almost a long-term game, but at the same time, the like people's lives are affected like right now. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do you play that long-term game and then still manage the situation right now? And I think to a large degree, uh, reaching uh, people, changing legislation, changing how people think about trans people, how people particularly feel about trans people, is a very important part of the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Because what I think what often happens is uh, because uh, many people don't personally know somebody who is trans, the experience is
Mm-hmm.
foreign and alien to them. And so there's no sense of how a person can connect to that kind of experience. And so on that basis, there's it leaves very little room for somebody to empathize with
Right.
somebody. And that is I think that is also partly largely to do with how our narratives have been excluded very much from one in advocacy spaces. When I remember, I think it was yesterday, I was in a forum for GBV, and
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like LGBT issues were just like there in the background and not necessarily placed like as as a
Right.
very legitimate concern. It's representation in our media. We need more of that, and I honestly don't know what the fix is here. I do think we are heading in a good direction, though.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of work being done, uh, and we're starting to see the fruits of that now, uh, in these
Mm-hmm.
little increments. But
Thank you.
we've just got to keep pushing forward. Yeah, I
We
guess.
just got to
Thank
keep
you. Sorry.
going. Yes. For the last few minutes, I'm going to please open up to everybody that's been on the call. There's been some great comments and questions in the chat group, which has been really amazing. Just Melinda affirming the need for a depathologized approach, particularly for trans children. which has been really amazing. And then, yeah, the big question that Mila is also raising around how do we deal with TERFs, right? Or I guess people who are anti-trans, how do we deal with the new mythical theory called gender ideology, um, which is basically very anti-trans as well. So of course we are facing a ton of pushback uh, um, in relation to our existence and our right to exist. Um, so I'd like to open up, if you can use the hand button for any questions that you may have. Anil, over to you.
Thanks, Jabu. I just wanted to say that from my personal experience, I've had pathologization used against me in a
Mm-hmm,
personal relationship where I was basically told, since I have a mental disorder and I'm diagnosed in terms of the DSM, obviously I'm mentally ill. Nothing I say is therefore valid. Everything I say is just, if I'm putting in boundaries in a relationship, if I'm insisting on my rights, I am just confirming that I'm mentally ill, and nothing I say has any validity. And this is the deep, deep damage that this kind of narrative of mental illness does, is that it's used as a weapon against us. And I think, to kind of link up with what the conversation that's been going on in the
yeah.
chats is, you've got all of these narratives, and we're being told we don't exist, we don't have a right to exist. Okay, we do exist, but we're very, very mentally ill. And
Mm-hmm,
these are all the messages that are in the mainstream of society. And how do we then challenge this? And I think that the one thing I can say is that every single one of us who stands up and is visible is challenging that, and we are making a huge difference in society, in the way society
mm-hmm,
sees us. People like Zoe who are standing up and being visible, anyone who is in their ordinary life standing up and being visible. You make it easier for the next person who is trying to navigate their identity as
mm-hmm,
transgender to do that in a healthy way. And I'm thinking, if we're talking about what replaces this narrative of pathologization, and for me, that's always a tension because I'm working in access to healthcare. So on the one
mm-hmm,
hand, you, we want to kind of share off all the pathologization. On the other hand, you still want to say, argue that yes, we have a right to access healthcare, and people are going, okay, and why do you need healthcare if you're not sick? And I've been thinking a lot around this, around, we talk in terms of dysphoria, but possibly what we really need to be talking about is in terms of euphoria, that we're not sick, we're engaging in health-seeking behavior. And there's been a lot of movement in this in psychology in the last few years, in mainstream psychology, saying we are not, you don't need to be mentally ill to use the tools of psychology to seek better mental health and a deeper, happier human life.
right.
And I think that's possibly the way we need to be framing ourselves, that we are engaging in healthy seeking of healthcare that is going to enable us to live a really full human life. And that's something
Mm-hmm,
that we need to be proud of. And I think that's possibly how we start shifting.
yeah, yeah, totally. Um, Anybody else from the group? It's amazing. We have 37 people on the call, and I'm sure you all have thoughts. So um, I'd like to, you know, yeah, just please. No question is a bad question, and no opinion is a wrong one. So don't. I think just please add. I guess the question as well tomorrow and to Zoe. Is within the historical approaches of on trans identities, how do we embrace or embody or include a depathologization around non-binary identities, and how does non-binary identities, and then I guess the gender affirming care for trans people who um, desire hormonal therapy or medical surgeries, etc., or whatever other health services they desire in their transition. How do you co-correlate that relationship in depathologization?
Well, um, you know, for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
trans people were described as people that, because of a mental disorder, hated our own bodies and want to transition to a new body, which was a body of, the opposite sex. So in the most pathologizing approaches to trans issues, there are only two sexes, and people go from one sex to another. Something that trans people
Mm-hmm.
introduce by, for example, introducing the concept of transgender is that actually we move, we transition, but not necessarily between two poles like male or female or masculine and feminine, but we just modify our bodies in order to be ourselves and to express ourselves. So
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, trans people and binary people and anyone that would like to modify, their bodies to express their identities and to be themselves should be allowed to do that. And what we are seeing in, like, even in classifications, including in the new international classification of diseases, that binary language has been dropped. No one talks anymore about going from one sex to the opposite sex. Just, people getting access to gender affirming procedures to be themselves, to feel congruent with the way in which they experience their gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an absolute compatibility, which, between being non-binary and having surgeries and hormones. It doesn't mean that in order to pathologize yourself, you need to be non-binary. It's
Yeah.
just to be able to do and to identify as you are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dylan, I see your hand.
Hi, thank you for allowing me to participate. My name is
Right.
Dylan. I'm a research psychologist and I'm currently doing my PhD at Wits in psychology. I just wanted to ask, part of the institutional violence and problems that face the transgender community in South Africa is the lack of access to any form of gender affirming care, and that it's a
Mm-hmm.
very gate kept process, and that leads to a lot of barriers to access. I wanted to ask if, in anyone's personal experience or just in their specific knowledge or in the area, if that at all relates to the reason why there are such strongly held stigmatic beliefs, and those stigmatic beliefs in society are part of the fuel behind more physical violence and discrimination that people face in their everyday. Sorry, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Who would like to tackle that question?
Uh,
So
Hi, Java. It's Zoe. So
yeah.
I think, sorry, I'm totally going to put Anil on the spot here, but I know Anil works as health at GDX, and so potentially this
Mm-hmm.
is a area that Anil might be best positioned to, I think, deal with. I'm sorry, Anil, if I'm putting you on the spot now.
Sure. Um, I mean, look, I guess the question, if I understand it, is that is there an interrelationship between the violence that trans people experience and the systemic discrimination? If I understand that, Dylan, to be the question. And I would say absolutely, because the systemic discrimination is inherently meant to kill trans people. It is inherently meant to erase trans people as a way of not existing either in the form of a legal identification and in terms of a legal document. So legal gender recognition is a way of, the lack of gender legal recognition is a way of erasure of trans people and trans lives, right? And then added to that is the issues that we are discussing now around the World Health Organization and the international classification of diseases, and having categorized trans identities as a mental health disorder, etc. And so therefore, letting clinicians be the gatekeepers of determining our identities. And for decades and for centuries, we've been paying clinicians to affirm who we are. And now we're saying we no longer, one, we don't need that, we've never needed it, and it's violent. So when a system perpetuates violence, it tells its citizens that it's permitted to commit that very violence on the very bodies that the state inherently is violating. So I absolutely, there is the coexistence of interpersonal and systemic violence, and I think we should absolutely name the transphobia that exists within a government and within a system. And so when a system is never designed for you to live, if we look at the statistics of the death rate of trans people across the world, none of us live enough to enjoy a pension or retirement or to live an elderly existence, because the system is never set up to allow us the right to life, the right to human dignity, and the right to just live in a humane way. So I guess when we look at that and we look at depathologization, um, we have to think about what are our actions, you know, uh, in the preservation of life, in the preservation of trans lives, um, and we see what's happening now across the world, around the Black Trans Lives Matter campaigns, etc. So for me, I think that becomes a fundamental issue to how we understand pathology in so many ways. In my concluding thoughts, I just want to ask Mauro and Zoe to leave us with messages of, I guess, encouragement in relation to where we're going on depathologization. What can we do better?
I think, you know, maybe this is like a very personal thing, because I have been working in this field for a long time.
Mhm.
And so I have seen changes in places where you know, that were really tough, like working with the World Health Organization, working with governments. The place where we need to be better and we should be better, and I really hope that we are going to be better, is the internal infighting and the way in which we treat
Yeah.
each other. I know that it sounds maybe naive, but it seems in the past 10 years, it has been possible to change many things. We still need to find out a way of disagreement, or having disagreements and solving them, taking care of each other. So we are going to win and to have real wins when we learn to respect each other and try to work together, and with, you know, and trying to work against horizontal hostility, because the enemy is not the trans person that is just standing next to me and they use a different word or just express their gender in a different way. That's what I believe that we still need to.
Absolutely. Thank you. Zoe?
Yeah, I think Mari took the words like right out of my mouth. For uh, I think for a lot of us working in advocacy spaces, we're kind of working toward the same thing, and I think sometimes language and the way we communicate sometimes gets in the way of that, because we're not using the right words, or we differ on certain little issues and stuff. And I think coming to a point of mutual understanding and common interest uh, in moving forward, in attempting to, one, depathologize the law, uh, and then also socially depathologizing uh, how society broadly engages with us, and also depathologizing how we see our own selves and our own trans bodies. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to thank everybody for being on this conversation and part of this conversation. Um, I'm sure you have so many thoughts, so many feelings, um, and sometimes we just need time to process what we are engaging on, because it's such hard conversations. And yeah, please join us for the next conversations. We will definitely be speaking about what Mila was suggesting around the issue of TERFs. We will be speaking about gender ideology in our next topics. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Maro, and thank you to Zoe for being part of the conversation. Thank you, Layla, for organizing everything so well. And just to let everybody know, this will be a podcast. We will publish it. Until then, the recordings are not to be used in any particular way and so forth, but you can use the podcast once it's ready for sharing. Thank you, and have a great afternoon further. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you
Goodbye
so much,
and
everyone.
thank you. Thank you.